My name is Eleanor and I'm a volunteer at the festival, and I'd like you to meet some of our other volunteers and past board members. We have Rita Doyle, who is a board member and is a volunteer for over 55 years. We have Peter Hussey, who's a current volunteer, and David Maguire, a current volunteer, who's also our Volunteer of the Year this year. So congratulations to David.
Thank you.
And whoever would like to start is, I think Rita might like to start because she was at the first opera of the Rosa Castile, so she might like to start some of her memories.
Yes, indeed. I have very happy memories of the first Rose of Castile. I had spent a year in bed with rheumatic fever, and it was suggested I'd go to boarding school, and I ended up in St. Mary's in Arklow, which was a wonderful music school at the time. And lo and behold, at the first midterm break, my dad came up and collected my sister Mary and me to come back to Wexford for the few days, and he told us on the way down we were going to this opera, the Rose of Castile. He had been very friendly with Eva Cousins, who was Dr. Cousins' wife, or Dr. Tom Walsh's wife, and who was a wonderful, wonderful woman in the start of the days of the Wexford Festival Opera. She donated a lot of her money to it and time. And we came to the Rose of Castile in the old Theatre Royal, and we enjoyed it enormously. But to this day, I carry the memory of Constance Shacklin, who was the soprano, slightly taller than Murray Dickey. And lo and behold, I had never seen a man in high heels before. And here Murray Dickey was in these block higher heels. And I was totally, utterly and entirely fascinated with them, considering I can remember them to this day. And about 25 years later, I was at the opera in Vienna, and lo and behold, Murray Dickey comes out on stage as the innkeeper. And what was he wearing? Only his high heels. Well, I thought this was absolutely fascinating. Himself and Constance had got married, and they had 3 boys. And their middle son was an opera singer. And of course, it would have been lovely, wonderful, if we could have had him here this year for the 70th anniversary. But unfortunately, COVID took care of that. But one never knows. But that is my first memory of the very first festival, the Rose of Castile.
And that's funny, Rita, because you were in the Theatre Royal, as all 3 of us would have been. So, David, maybe would you like to think of something that you remember mainly? Or what?
Well, I was just, again, going back as a very young boy in 1976. My first introduction to the festival was through Jim Golden. He would have been a neighbour at the time. Jim was box office manager and general dog's body around the building, organised everything. They were looking for walk-on parts. So in 1976, I had a walk-on part in, what was the name? It was Gianni Giarco. And I've been involved basically ever since. I worked backstage for about 10 years, and I've been front of house ever since.
Okay. So Jim Golden has a lot to answer for, because I think Jim got me going as well, because I remember my first job with Jim was putting stamps on envelopes, and you had to put the stamp exactly a certain distance from the top and a certain distance from the side. It had to be done right. And I think he got you into, Peter, if I remember.
Well, yes, eventually he did, although that was some 20 odd years later, because in 1977 I got a job as manager in White's Hotel, and the starting day was the day after the 1977 Opera Festival, a Monday, and I arrived in White's Hotel and wondered had I made a mistake, because the place was very, very quiet, didn't seem to have any customers, and the staff were thin on the ground. And eventually somebody explained, of course, that the Opera Festival had finished the previous night, and there had been hundreds of people in the building and so on and so forth, and next year I would see all of this. And I really thought it was exaggerated. But a year later, I discovered they weren't exaggerating at all. And on the opening night of the 78th festival, I was standing at the door just after the opera finished. And it was a bit like it has been in the last couple of days, absolutely pouring rain. Now, I was standing there with a doorman because I was told that we would need a doorman for the number of people who were going to arrive. And anyway, running up the old steps of White's, that some of you will remember, came this man wearing a Garda traffic cone on his head. And he crashed through the doors, right past me, and almost immediately he was followed by two young guards who grabbed hold of him and dragged him back out again. And I said to the doorman, "Who was that?" And he said, "You'll get to know him. He's a prominent local solicitor." Now, the same prominent local solicitor, I believe, was at the opera the other night. And with his constant bravo, we know that he was very happy. But that was my first experience. And of course, literally hundreds of people came in through that door that night until the building literally wouldn't hold anymore. So that's my first memory. But of course, there are lots more. And things that come to mind are things like the fact that White's Hotel had been a coaching inn from 1779. So it was almost 200 years old, probably Ireland's oldest hotel at the time. And it had its own coach. So people who went from White's Hotel to the opera could, if they wished, go by coach. And there was a very friendly coachman who would open the door for them, seat them in, and clip-clop down the street to the opera house and come back and get the next couple. And that was a nice sort of little something different. And it worked for many, many years until the coach, which wasn't the best, began to list rather heavily to one side. So when you arrived at the opera house, you didn't so much get out of the coach, but sort of fall out of the coach. And finally, our insurers said, enough, no more coaches to the opera. But it was a nice little thing that happened. And they were my first sort of memories of the opera festival, but there are many more.
Funnily, Peter, I had forgotten all about that coach till you remember it. Now that you say it, I remember it. I'm sure you do too, David.
I do indeed. I remember as a boy. I can remember the coach driver. Again, we're showing our age here.
Mr. Breen.
Mr. Breen.
Yeah.
Well, yes. Mr. Breen.
I travelled in that coach many a time from my home on the Main Street to the old theatre, especially when it was raining. He would come down and collect me.
There you are.
We're very privileged.
Before we get the guests, I'd be going up an hour early anyway. And he'd come along, and yes, it was quite a wobbly drive, I can tell you that.
And what about opening ceremonies, Rita? You would have done those for years.
Oh, for years and years, yes. We had brilliant opening ceremonies. We had very, very funny ones, very happy ones, very wet ones. I remember when the opera train started to come from Dublin, and it would come into the station, and we got the brainwave that would go down there, and the Lochorman Silver Band would come. We'd ask them, would they come down to welcome the guests, and they'd play on the platform. It was absolutely delightful. And then we'd have the two coaches, particularly when it would be raining. Otherwise, the guests used to walk from the opera train right up to the Theatre Royal. They were absolutely wonderful nights, those. They really and truly were. And one didn't know who was going to step off that train. You could have ministers, lords, ladies, princes, counts, anybody and everybody, and nobody arrived on those opera trains. They were absolutely magical and served fabulous food.
And some of my early memories as well, it was the opera train, again, as a very small boy. At Guinness Clock, I don't know, Rita, you probably remember.
Oh, yeah. Yes, it used to be down at the station.
As a small boy, seeing Amy de Valera arriving down on the train, getting to his car, and, that's going back a while. I was in nappies, I'd say, at that stage. But I do
that Guinness Clock, people still talk about the Guinness Clock.
It's gone a long time.
Yeah.
Well, talking talking of Guinness, Rita will remember the Guinness buffets.
Oh yes, Lord and Lady Ivy's. Yes.
Yes, and what made me think of that was when you said Lord and Ladies, and originally they all took place in White's Hotel, and there were two of them, and the great and the good were invited to these things, usually about 200 plus people, but there was always a great difference between the two buffets, and the reason for this was that Guinness, naturally being Guinness, had to have a Guinness host. So on one of the weeks, it was Lord Moyne, right? Now, Lord Moyne, I shouldn't talk about him, he was a grey-haired, balding gentleman, right? But anyway, very nice man who was very anxious to meet everybody. And literally as a guest, when he had something to say to everybody. So the queue went on and on and on and on, and it took a very long time for the buffet to get going. Whereas his co-host the following week, the Earl of Ivy, was quite the reverse, right? And you barely got a nod out of him. And as a result, the people were very, very quickly. But when Lord Moyne was on one occasion, we actually had to ring the opera house and ask them would they hold the opera, because it wasn't as if you were asking them to hold it just for 2 people. You were asking it for 200 people. So it was virtually half of the audience who weren't there. So anyway, that's Lord Moyne and the Guinness buffets. They were.
Mr. Maguire wouldn't hold the house for now 200, I don't think, would you, David?
We do not. We're very strict on those, and that in itself has led to interesting times. We're very strict. It starts at 8. No latecomers, and on occasion we have had ministers arriving 5 minutes late, and I'm sorry, minister, you're not getting in. So, which has it's fun, but we have some colourful moments, and my name has been taken, and solicitors' names have been mentioned, and they're going to see you do not know who I am, but that's all part of the fun and joy of it.
One of my greatest things about the festival, I think, at the moment is when you come back every year, it's great. It's as if you haven't been away for a year. You get to all the volunteers as if they all know each other. It's like yesterday you were talking to them and we're all back as one again. I just think that's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing when we come in.
After with this COVID, it's been 2 years since we've been together. I totally agree with you, Anna. But as the patrons as well, like we've all got great friends we've met over the years, and going back 20 and 30 years. And we haven't changed a bit. Thank God, most people, we're all getting older and grayer, but it's great to meet them again. And it's as if we've only been in a different room for a few days, It's great.
Yeah, I just thought of that today. It was really like that.
Yeah, there was a man whose name, unfortunately, I can't remember, who I'm not sure if he's here this year, but for some reason or other, maybe because he stayed for years and years in White's for the festival, used to meet me at the Opera House and say, for some reason or other, he thought I was John Small, and he would meet me annually at the Opera House and say, "Oh, how lovely to meet you, Mr. Little." And I'd say, "Small." I said, "You were very close." But David mentioned little or latecomers, and he might remember the night in the old house when these 4 people arrived late, and they were half of a party of 8 people, and the friends had the tickets, so they didn't know where they were sitting. So anyway, the usual arrangement, up the stairs to listen to the music of the opera and be given a glass of champagne. And anyway, we did that, and about 20 minutes later, we suddenly see them coming back down the stairs. And the first gentleman says to me, "We're really familiar with the music of My Fair Lady, and we haven't heard a single number from it." They should have been in Dunwira. And Jim Golden, standing by, says, "I hope you didn't give them any champagne."
stuff.
Yeah.
Poor Jim Golden's. We've had a good days and bad days in the opera as well. Again, an unfortunate incident once. A very sick man took bad during the opera. Took very bad during the opera, and he was wheeled out, going into an ambulance. And all Jim Golden wanted to know what seat he was sitting in because he was on to sell a seat the following night. Jim was legendary. Thank God, before fire officers, he used to double book everything. So we regularly have 110% occupancy in the opera house because they'd sell too many seats and hoping people wouldn't turn up. But the nights they turned up, benches for seats and chairs were got from everywhere in the house.
Did you ever get one of the beautiful jobs of having to go in and ask a local to come out?
Oh, yes.
Because he had somebody that urgently needed to get a seat.
Important arrives last minute. Yeah, so me and you were pulled out. That happens all the time. That happened regularly. Jim was great. Jim and Ted were legendary, and they could write. There should have been a book written about it, but I think it would have been banned. Some things that went on here.
I had that experience of being sent to ask a local. And
oh, yes.
I sort of hope that Rita has forgotten it. It was Rita I had to go and ask to move, right? My friend and neighbour.
Well, I'll tell you that
she was very dignified about it.
I bet it was, yes. I mean, my tickets were taken so often, and the storyline was always, I'll make it up to you towards the end of the festival, definitely. We'll get you in some night before the end. But I think I'm working with my 11th chairman at the moment. It started off with Dr. Des French, went from him to Sean Scallon, Dick Jeffries, Jim Golden, Barbara Wallace, Ted Howland, John O'Connor, Paul Hennessy, Ger Lawler, Philip Scallon, and now with Dr. Mary Daly. And they, each and every one of them, had their own style and their own strengths and weaknesses. And I'll tell you something, for nothing, I learned a lot over the 55 years. I really did, because they were all very individual people to work with, and definitely had different strengths where the festival was concerned. And there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever the festival wouldn't be the success it is today but for the input and hard work of those people.
Yeah, the boards work very hard, as did all the chairs.
Yes, and all of the voluntary workers, of course, you know.
Yeah, and the staff. The fact that we now have a large staff compared to when we started out was...
Yes. Yes, indeed, yes. The first year I worked with the festival was 1966, and Dr. Tom had decided he didn't want to have anything more to do with the festival, and they owed £1,200, which was a lot of money in those days. And the November meeting had head of the agenda whether or not the festival would go on. I mean, there was this balance of £1,200, and they really didn't know. They were going about 15 years at the time. And it was decided at that meeting, Sir Alfred Byte, bless him, would pay up the money, and they would have a new committee, and Dr. Des French was made the chairman, and they decided that they'd have to have young blood. And I had just come home. My father had had his first heart attack, and I came home to run the business. And Mairead Furlong had only married Nicky at the time. And we had done a wonderful job selling Terry Flynn, which was the first fundraiser I worked for Wexford Festival Opera. And we made a great success of it. It was down in the Doon Wirra with that wonderful, wonderful actor, Donal McCann. Oh, himself and Maureen Dolan gave a superb performance. And we were very anxious to sell out the full theatre because the surplus cash was going as a fundraiser to the festival. And that was my very first initiation to fundraising for Wexford Festival Opera. That was 56 years ago.
And Rita, you were the one that got me into programs. You put me in there, and I'm still there. A number of years later, I haven't moved in it.
Yeah. We had so many wonderful girls. I can remember Mary Lampert. Do you remember Mary Griffin or Osler?
Mhm.
And Mary McMurrough. These are, if they heard me saying, I'm describing them as golden oldies now, but they were there in the very beginning, and they were wonderful. Absolutely, we had to change the whole tenure of the theatre and try and get in a lot of young people at that stage, which we succeeded in doing. Yeah, it was a hard start, but it worked.
Yeah. Rita, you'll remember when the singers, the principal singers, used to stay in White.
Indeed, yes, we used to be hanging out of our drawing room windows because I lived over in the shop on the main street, and we'd be hanging out of the drawing room windows every evening. Oh yes, because the singers would be going up in full costume from White's Hotel up to the Theatre Royal. It was absolutely magic. Yes, I remember Dalla Mangus and Monty. Yes, and I remember Monty did a whirl. He had spotted us in the window, and he did a whirl in his cloak for Mary and myself. I remember that. That's a long time ago.
Well, I don't remember that far back.
Yeah, why I mentioned that, I remember being taken, probably in my innocence, by the fact that when I saw the original bookings for these people, a lot of them seemed to have double rooms.
Yes.
And I couldn't understand how these people were traveling around. Were they all traveling around with their husbands and wives and so forth? But John Small took me to one side and said, no, you have to understand the extra person in the room. It's their interpreter. Yeah. Of course, a lot of these people were obviously...
they're yes, Italians and
there were a lot of interpreters still. Yeah.
You have to take into consideration Wexford was a different place than 55 years ago. We were on our knees financially, nationally, and it really was. The Wexford Festival was founded by the five men, Dr. Tom, Jim Liddy, Eugene McCarthy, Seamus O'Dwyer, and who's the fifth? Oh, I'll think of it in a minute. This is the
French.
Pardon?
Des French?
Des French. And you see, they really, when Sir Compton Mackenzie suggested that they do the opera themselves, rather than be listening to them at the Gramophone Society, this was a wonderful opportunity to develop the tourist industry, whereby White's Hotel could get people staying between the summer and Christmas. That was an awful long period business-wise in those days. And you really had a hard sell. And I'll have to commend Eugene McCarthy because he did Trojan work at that stage to get the hotel built, as also did the Talbot. The Ferry Carrick wasn't there. And the Kellys and Hotel in Rosslare were hugely helpful in getting the festival off its feet at that time. And I remember when that man was murdered by the IRA up in Sligo.
Lord Mountbatten.
Yeah. Our fax machine was going for 24 hours afterwards with cancellations from the English market. Now, you've no idea nowadays what that was, but that was literally a catastrophe for Wexford. And a couple of years after, in 1971, we did Cabanova and Il Pirata, two wonderful operas, and Gavin Henderson, who was the artistic director of the York Festival, invited Wexford Festival Opera to take those two operas to York. And Ricky Shannon and myself, in our bone shaker, do you remember those Renault cars with the gears up on top? The Renault 4s. Well, Ricky and myself set off from Wexford to York with costumes and wigs and what have you to the York Festival. And it was, Joe Malone was head of portfolio at the time, and he had told us that we could invite everyone who had attended the Wexford Festival from within 100 miles of York. And we made out the list and sent, and I think we had 85 people in those days coming from that part of the world. I mean, nowadays you think this was great. And they did that reception, and it was absolutely the beginning of the English market opening up again, and the Scottish market. Thereafter, well, Thompson Smiley was the artistic director at that time. He was with us in New York. And poor Dolly felt the blood, would be merciful to her. And Dolly got the shingles in York. It was dreadful. She had worked so hard, God love her, on those costumes. And that was really. But the Duchess of York, who was a concert pianist herself, we invited her to the last performance with the monks out in the Abbey, and Dom Hume, who later became the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. And when we went out to Amplecourt, a Miss Keating, who was from Clermont originally, was the head housekeeper there. So we invited her into the opera, and we got a huge response from the locals. That was the beginning of the resurgence of the English market, which is very vital, of course, to Wexford Festival Opera, because it doesn't matter a damn what you put on the stage if you do not have bums on seats paying money to see it, because that's what pays the bills.
That's true.
Well, Rita will remember Bernard Levin.
Oh, very well. Yes, I sat beside him at the first press conference in Rules. Yes.
Yeah, and he came, of course, with I don't know if you remember Alan Wood of
Yes,
in England.
Lane.
And you probably will be aware of a story that's probably been much exaggerated over the years about Bernard coming back to White's Hotel at around 2:00 in the morning from some post-opera party and claiming to be hungry and being invited to go to the kitchen and fry himself some bacon and eggs, which apparently he did, or so he had a number of witnesses. And as a result, Alan Wood hosted this dinner annually for Bernard Levin and his friends. And this went on, as I say, for 20 years. And on the 20th year, we had a special medal minted, which I had the honour of presenting to Bernard for his services to breakfast cookery.
Excellent.
And,
Interesting facts.
yeah.
There's stories I never heard before. I haven't heard that one before. Had you heard that one, David? No?
No, not at all, not at all.
Yeah.
I had, yes.
Well, there was a special menu. Yeah.
But the festival is full of stories like that.
Full of stories, yeah.
Yeah, there was a special menu printed with a description at the bottom, because every item on the menu was served with bacon and eggs. And we actually got Bernard to stand up from the table, and we had a little table with a frying pan, and we got him to actually cook the bacon and eggs on year 20. So he got this magnificent medallion around his neck, anyway, as a result.
Oh, that's interesting.
I attended the first press conference in Rule's restaurant in London, where Terry Sheehy was the head of Lord Falcha in Bond Street. And Terry Sheehy was a Kerry man, wonderfully helpful to Wexford Festival Opera, because he had been Dr. Tom's best man at his second wedding. And he looked after us extremely well. And he went out of his way to invite the right people to that luncheon every year in Rule's restaurant, which was absolutely a great benefit to the broadening of the sales of the Wexford Festival seats. Every year we met new people who were anxious to come, and that worked right up until and through the Tony O'Reilly years. You know, there was always these people who came and who brought their friends the following year. Yeah, Wexford Festival has had a lot of work. It didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen easily, but it was fun.
Yeah, but the thing is, Rita, everybody there's a great spirit of people willing to help when you go to do anything.
Oh, yes, yes.
I mean, you get that everywhere from people that, like you were saying about the Sheedy, everybody who becomes in contact seems to want to help.
Yes.
Because I remember the night, David, you might remember the night we had the great flood. Remember that? And people couldn't get in. And remember Peter Scallon going out in trying to rescue singers who couldn't get in? Remember that?
Myself and Peter in the lifeboat, the Iron Lion, and we had to get our full kit, our full waterproof dry suits, go down, and I distinctly remember happy memories of carrying some of the younger orchestra members from their apartments and the key up to the opera house. But what I remember is a fierce flood, the whole town flooded. I still can remember some elderly ladies coming in the main street, and the water was up to their knees. But it was such a fantastic, how do you do it? We've lived through the war. This is nothing, and I think that was the spirit was there.
Remember Giuseppini Conti was in one of the Pierce Court apartments, and you had to take her out from the upper floor onto the roof.
Oh, there was some lovely photographs. But I remember, there was a lot of famous singers lifted. The show went on, and we were a few minutes late that night, but the show did.
And people came in that night, and they had to take their shoes off inside. They were absolutely soaked, but that was the spirit of helping.
It was.
Well, I have a little memory of that because my wife, Marie, also a volunteer, worked in the bar at that time. And the much loved and, late Jerome came out on the stage. I assume we're talking about the same night.
That's right.
Invited everybody to a glass of wine at the interval. Now, so that was sort of 400 odd people, right? But the bar hadn't been told that this was going to happen, and until he'd actually made the announcement. So there was a considerable flurry of activity to find 400 glasses in the right place to fulfill this promise. So I'd say that would be their memory of the night.
Yeah, it's funny.
That story reminds me of the fun that was in the bar when the Mars. We used to call it the Mars Bar. And Margaret Marr and John and her mother, they did Trojan work every year in the bar, but there was always an incident. There was either a shortage of glasses or someone appeared, and we had indeed some presidents arrive in one door as the paintbrushes were going out the other. There are lots of funny stories like that, but we won't go into those now. But I will say that the Margaret Marr and Johnny and her mother, Mrs. Hislop, did Trojan work, as indeed John's father had done for the festival in the days of Tom Walsh, because in those days there was nothing really in Wexford to entertain the artists when they came. So John Marr out in Ballinkeel used to entertain the cast of each opera to lunch, and that was a highlight of their stay in Wexford when they all went out to the country. It was a country house, and out to the country, and they were lucky enough to have a fine day and visit the garden. That enhanced their visit. I mean, when I think of how little we have in Wexford and how much we have, the amount, we've been so lucky with the artistic directors. The first director I worked with was Brian Dickey. He was 25, tall, cheeky, and handsome. And he really and truly was a breath of fresh air. There was no doubt in the world about it. And then Thompson Smiley came along. And Thompson was completely different because he was a newspaper man originally, and then curator in Slack. And then, of course, we had the first woman who was the first artistic director who kept to her budget, and that was the wonderful Elaine Powell. And then, of course, there's Luigi, and we are so lucky to have Rosetta now, because really Rosetta has grown up here in Wexford. She's been with us all the time. She was with us for as long as I can remember her. And we are so lucky to have somebody who understands, because we need to be understanding. We're different here in Wexford. There's no doubt in the world about it. We're very different to what on the East Coast or to what they are in other parts of Ireland.
Rita, you'll remember the amazing Colonel Price.
Of course I do. Oh, I do. I remember it very well, yes.
you were talking about, people being entertained. He, of course, liked to entertain.
Yes.
And on one occasion, he came in to see me and to say that he wanted to entertain these people on the opening night. And he was wondering, what might be suitable and so on and so forth. And he said to me, sir, I'm not really a food man, but my wife is a food expert. So would you mind very much if she were to come in with me tomorrow and meet the chef, so that we could discuss the menu? So anyway, I said yes, that'll be fine, Colonel, and set this up with the chef. Now the chef at the time was a wily Kerryman, right? Who wasn't going to be bested by the wife of some English colonel.
Yes.
Who claimed that his wife was a food expert.
Yes.
So we sat in my office at the time, right? And straight away, he asked Mrs. Price what was she thinking of as a starter. And she thought, well, maybe something a little bit unusual at the time. They might start with borscht. And he said to her, Mrs. Price, now, would you be thinking of Polish borscht or Russian borscht? And that was the end of
that conversation.
The end of the conversation.
Well, I'll have to say, in payment of David Price, he started the Friends of the Wexford Festival Opera. And he hosted the first Friends party over in the Arts Centre. But I'll tell you another short story about David. When we took over the Theatre Royal in 1967, that was the first festival I worked on. And the pictures had been removed off the wall. And in those days, everybody smoked. So when it was raining outside, they smoked in the foyer, which meant that when the pictures were taken off the wall, the marks were dirty. And I remember about a month before the festival, we were having a meeting. We were all brought up to the theatre, and I brought up this matter of this ugly wall and how dirty it was. And I remember Dale's friend saying to me, I was directing my question to him because he was the chairman, and he said no, that he really was looking after the artistic end of it and backstage, and that the person I would refer myself to would be Sean Scallon, because he was doing front of house. So I went along to Sean, came along, and I said, that wall, that looked dreadful there. And he agreed with me. And I said, do you think we could have it painted or something done with it? And he said to me, I'll always remember, Rita, you have only just joined the council. And I want to tell you, our function is to put 2 operas on the stage, that stage there. We have no money to be painting walls. End of story. And I went home that evening giggling to myself. And Murphy's the painters. I don't know whether anybody will remember Kathleen Murphy. They were painters, wonderful people down in Selsker. And they were painting our shop. And I said to Mr. Murphy, how much would a tin of paint cost? And he said, well, why are you asking? And I said, well, I would have a wall about 12 feet that needs to be painted. And he said, and who's going to paint it? And me, in my innocence, said, Mairead Furlong and myself, we never had a paintbrush in our hands in our lives, but we were going to do this wall. So anyway, to tell a long story short, he said he'd come up to the theatre that night and he'd look at the wall. And I rang Sean Scallon and I said, Mr. Murphy's coming down at 8 o'clock and I'd appreciate if you'd be there. He said, I told you we'd no money. I said, and he knows we've no money. I've only asked him how much the paint would be, and I was going to collect around the street for this wall. And out Mr. Murphy came and he took one look at it and he said, is that it? And I said, yes. Well, he said, it'll need to be cleaned and it'll need 2 coats. And I said, but we've no money, this is the problem. We've no money. Mr. Scallon has said we've no money for this. And he said, and he did it voluntarily. Bless that man, not alone. I went up 2 evenings later, it was the front wall, but he painted from there up to the door of the theatre, which was pure magic. And fair dues to Sean Scallon. They had taken the carpet up the stairs, which was filthy, and well, you know, after wear and wet and rain, and they cleaned it. But David Price had got a table, a gold finished table and mirror to match. And that was put in the front of the old Theatre Royal and was there right up until the theatre was closed. And I remember Johnstown Castle doing a floral arrangement. And the first night we opened in 1967, we were posh. We were really spruced up. Beautiful carpet, beautiful walls, and David Price's table. I don't know where he got it, but he got a donation of it, and it was there right up at the end.
Well, Rita, thank you for that. And I think that should be enough to give enough memories. We could talk for ages about our various memories.
We could, yeah.
So thanks to Rita and David and Peter. And that's our memories from Wexford for this year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.